Hi, this is Tara. Today we're studying Sutra number 41. What does it say?
kṣīṇa-vṛtteḥ abhijātasya-iva maṇeḥ grahītṛ-grahaṇa-grāhyeṣu tat-stha-tat-añjanatā samāpattiḥ. kṣīṇa-vṛtteḥ, whom the vrittis have weakened, abhijātasya, well polished, iva, just like maṇeḥ, a crystal, grahītṛ, cognizer, grahana, process of cognizing, grāhyeṣu, that which is cognized, tat-stha, on which it rests, tat-añjanatā, taking the color of that, samāpattiḥ, complete absorption.
Vedavyasa says what this means is becoming like a transparent crystal on the modifications disappearing. The mind acquires the power of thought transformation or samāpattiḥ, the power of appearing in the shape of whatever object is presented to it, be it the knower, the knowable, or the act of knowing. This is a slightly complex sutra, so I'll be repeating some of these words, and indeed Maharishi Vedavyasa also repeats a lot of these terms several times, so I'll go a bit slow. Now he says, what is the nature of the power of thought transformation? He's translating, or Sri Ramaprasada is translating samāpattiḥ as thought transformation. What is the nature of the power of thought transformation that the mind acquires when it has obtained rest? Rest of what? Rest of the vrittis. This is what is being described. So when the vrittis are at rest, the modifications are at rest, like a crystal, okay, placed next to an object. So what he's basically saying is, as a crystal placed next to something starts transmitting the light, the shape, the form of that thing which is just placed next to, so also a mind that is stilled is able to transmit the properties of what it genuinely sees. So colored by subtle elements placed in contact, it becomes the nature of the subtle elements and shines out in the shape of the subtle elements. Similarly, colored by the distinctions of the world coming into contact with it, it becomes the nature of those distinctions. So simply put, let me try and simplify this for you. Who am I to simplify Maharishi Vedavyasa? But let us make a bold and brave attempt. Okay. So what he's saying is, when the mind is disturbed by vrittis, okay, the modifications, it does not perceive correctly. When the vrittis are stilled, it basically becomes like a crystal that is placed next to an object and transmits the real nature of the object. It becomes transparent. It basically becomes a prism or a catalyst of reality, is what he is trying to say. So he also explains in this further that similarly, it is to be understood in the case of the acts of knowing. Okay, so colored by the acts of knowing, taken as objects of thought, it becomes the nature of the acts of knowing and shines out in forms which show the nature of the acts of knowing. Colored by the enjoying Purusha, that is basically the Purusha that is absorbed in Prakriti, that is absorbed in the world, that is entangled, that is not yet free. It transmits those forms of Purusha. And colored by the released Purusha, that is that which is separated from Prakriti, it becomes the nature of the released Purusha, shines out in the form which, is the nature of the released Purusha. So basically, what he is saying is, when the mind has these vrittis, what is this samāpattiḥ? It's thought transformation, right? It's complete absorption. So the mind becomes capable of viewing reality without its own sort of projections, its own sort of disturbances. I think the other gurus also explain this a little more elaborately. So let me go to Swami Satyananda, who says samāpattiḥ is a state of complete absorption of the mind, which is free from vrittis. into the three types of objects, such as cognizer, cognized, and senses, just as a polished crystal takes the color of that on which it rests. So samāpattiḥ means complete acceptance, complete absorption. Okay, just like, and the example he gives is the ocean fully accepts all the water poured into it by rivers. So it is a state of mind. Samāpattiḥ is a state of mind acquired by various practices like pranayama, penance, sadhana, tapasya, yoga. Okay, it is the immediate end in view before one practices samadhi. So when one is practicing yoga, one is aiming for samadhi. When one is practicing samadhi, one is aiming for samāpattiḥ. Just keep this in mind because B.K. Sangar also explains it in this format a little further down. So without, the point to remember right now is until samāpattiḥ is attained, one cannot speak of higher practices. But what higher practice means would depend on the capacities of an individual. Okay, so he's saying that, for instance, a person with really high consciousness does not really need japa, kirtan, the things that help us to routinely concentrate the mind. Okay, he can just close his eyes and enter a higher state. So he's saying call it simple sadhana and higher sadhana. One cannot go into higher states of sadhana until the mind is clear. For this clarity of mind, the state of meditation comes as easily, he says, as sleep comes to somebody who is drowsy. Okay, so for this, the vrittis must diminish. And he says it's not that we are trying to eliminate vrittis entirely, because we have to ultimately exist in this world, but we have to be able to diminish or weaken them. It's like the example he gives us, sleeping in a train. You're half asleep and then you can see people coming and going. But then eventually even that must go. That sleepiness, the fragmentary consciousness that he calls it, should also fade away. And the mind must become as pure and clear as crystal. And it can be applied to any object. That is the state of samāpattiḥ. Okay. So he says, now, if you put something like, you take a piece of paper and you put something like a glass on it, okay, or a piece of chalk, or it is not going to transmit that piece of paper entirely. Whereas you put a crystal on it, and a crystal that is pure, it is going to transmit it entirely. So, therefore, he says the mind has to become basically crystal clear. So when you practice trataka or meditation on an object like a shivlinga, he says the vrittis, when you're in the practice of a serious meditation, the vrittis start to diminish. And there's a point where the knower, the process of knowing, and the object of knowing just merge into one. And there is that flash of complete absorption. Okay, a seasoned practitioner of meditation or yoga, I think even at the lower levels, you can experience this as a flash. And one of the reasons the gurus say this flash is given to us is so that we know what to aspire to. So even if at a lower level of meditation, if your practice is consistent, it is rigorous, there'll be that one moment in which there is just complete unification. That is samāpattiḥ. And that is what you hold on to the more you practice, and you say, okay, I know what to move towards. Okay. And he says the three facets of the object, such as name, form, and meaning, which we also discussed in Sutra number 40, can be experienced separately. We discussed it with the example of the cow, the name cow, the object cow, the form of the cow. Right? These three, you start the more the mind gets concentrated, the more it's able to distinguish between these aspects of an object. See, in most of our normal everyday lives, we look at a cow on the road and we just think, oh, cow. We don't think name is separate, form is separate, signification is separate, object is separate. And there are also multiple more layers to that. Okay. We just club it all together and call it cow. But what happens with the concentrated mind is it is basically like a scalpel. It starts peeling the layers of object. So this is what he's explaining. And these are you can experience them separately. There are 6 types of fusion, basically called Savitarka, Nirvitarka, Savichara, Nirvichara, Ananda, and Asmita. We have studied these in the around Sutra 11 to 17. Okay, so you can go back and listen to those. They are the stages of fusion of your consciousness in relation to the object on which you are meditating. And finally, a time comes when the object vanishes. Okay, so this is what we are studying here in this sutra, is that vanishing of the object. Where does the object vanish to? It vanishes into the perception. This is basically what Jiddu Krishnamurti calls the observer becomes the observed. Okay, or the observed becomes the observer. You can have it either way. Here it's being expanded a little and saying the observer, the observed, and the process of observing all merge into one. Swami Vivekananda says the yogi whose vrittis have become powerless obtains in the receiver receiving and received concentratedness and sameness like the crystal. So what is the sutra answering the question of? He's saying what results from consistent and constant meditation. Swami Vivekananda says we must remember how in a previous aphorism, Patanjali went into the various states of meditation and how the first is gross, the second fine, from them the advances to still finer objects of meditation, and how in all these meditations, which are only of the first degree, we get as a result that we can meditate as easily on the fine as on the grosser objects. In Sutra number 40 also he says, from atom to infinity. The yogi's mind, once you become sharp, basically once the mind has become a scalpel, it can operate on anything. It can see the layers of basically anything, however small and however big. So he says there are three objects of meditation given to us. First, the gross as bodies or material objects. Second, fine things as the mind, it is chitta. And third is the purusha qualified, not purusha itself, but the egoism, the identification with body, the identification with Prakriti. So by practice, the yogi gets established in all these meditations. Whenever he meditates, he can keep out all other thought. And he becomes identified with that which he meditates. When he meditates, he is like a piece of crystal. Before flowers, the crystal becomes flowers. If the flower is red, the crystal looks red. Or if the flower is blue, the crystal looks blue. This is what happens to the mind. There is complete absorption with the object of meditation, is the point of this sutra. B.K. Iyengar says, the yogi knows that the knower of the instrument of knowing and the known are one, himself the seer. Like a pure transparent jewel, he reflects on unsullied purity. With refinement, the consciousness becomes highly sensitive, choiceless, stainless, and pure. So the perceiver, the instrument of perception, and the perceived object clearly reflected are nothing but the seer, all merge into one. One being the seer eventually being Purusha. So like an object reflected flawlessly in a clean mirror, the perceived perceiver and perceived object are reflected as one. The transparent reflecting quality of consciousness is termed samāpattiḥ, which means assumption of the original form of the seer. So it is total absorption. The meaning is total absorption. But total absorption of what is what B.K. Iyengar is explaining? Assumption of the original form of the seer. So Patanjali's description of samāpattiḥ indicates a subtle distinction between yoga, samadhi, and samāpattiḥ. Yoga is the means to reach samadhi. Samadhi is profound meditation, total absorption. Samāpattiḥ is the balanced state of mind of the seer, who having gained samadhi, radiates by his own pure state. So yoga and samadhi are practices. Samāpattiḥ is the state of mind which those practices lead towards. Okay, so when vritti sees sattvic, rajasic, and tamasic nature reach an end, the gunas basically cease separating. Okay, then the mind ceases to gather and transmit information. So chitta is like the still clear water of a calm lake. It transforms itself on the level of the seer and reflects its purity without refraction. I think this is a very beautiful example, because what he's basically saying is, if you could see without the subjectiveness of your mind getting in the way, and you would see far more clearly. And the thing is, all of us, whatever we see, whether we see a person, whether we see an idea, whether we see a situation, whether we see an object, we see with our own emotional baggage, our own mental chatter, our own distorted perception. None of our perceptions are pure. And because of that, we do not actually see the object. We see our lens before we see the object. So the process here is not to get, I think one of the strivings we do in the world is to constantly get purer and purer objects, right? But what he's saying, what Patanjali is saying is, and what B.K. Iyengar is explaining, is that the work here is to clarify the lens. So, like a transparent jewel, it becomes at once the knower, the instrument of knowing, and the known. Okay. And further on, he gives a bit more explanation, but he says that hunger and thirst are the only two needs of life. The rest of the vrittis can all be stilled or weakened considerably. Osho says when the activity of the mind is under control, the mind becomes like pure crystal, reflecting equally without distortion the perceiver, the perception, and the perceived. So, when the activity of mind is under control, what it means is that you are at the center and you look at the mind from there. Okay. And of course, being Osho, he goes into highly complex imagery for this example. Okay, but what he's basically talking about is the neti methodology of the Upanishads, where he says, I am not this, I am not this. It's a process of elimination. So a moment comes when you keep eliminating, when only the witness has remained. The witness, the process of witnessing, and the object of witnessing remains, and those merge. So this is the last stage of knowing and of being, and the very core in it. And he says you cannot deny it, because who is going to deny it? It's all merged into one. Okay. So he says you can't force yourself to be silent on the outside where your mind is running in the inside. And he gives an example of a small child who's forced to sit in the corner by his mother, and who tells his mother, you've made me sit down, but inside my mind I'm still running. So he says we are like that, right? You can't force yourself to be silent on the outside, and the inner, we assume that the inner will become silent because of that. So you have to invert that process, and that inversion is what is taking place here. When the mind is under control, the whole world becomes still, is what he's saying. There's perfect silence, you're rooted and centered inside. So when the mind becomes like pure crystal, all currents settle. And he tells a lovely story. He says Buddha is moving on the road and he gets very thirsty. They've crossed a bridge, so he sends his disciple Ananda back to fetch some water from the stream. It's a small stream, and since they have passed, some bullock carts have come and sullied the water. So Ananda comes back and he says, I was not able to get you any clear water. And he says, I'll go ahead, there's another stream ahead. Buddha says, I don't want water from the stream ahead, you go back and get it only from that stream. So Ananda goes back and he has no choice but to sit there and just wait. There's nothing else to be done, right? Because the stream is stirred up. So he's sitting there and he's just waiting and waiting and waiting. And eventually, when there is no motion and no movement and no disturbance, the stream stills and the dust settles to the bottom. And then he gets it. He comes back to the Buddha with water, but also with the understanding that you have to wait. We just observe and allow the mind to settle. In Buddhist meditation, this is what is known as shamatha meditation. Okay, so what Osho is explaining here is nobody can bring order to the mind externally. The very process of bringing order, the more you put your fingers in that water and try and settle it, you're going to stir it up and create chaos. What you have to do is wait, watch, observe, and perceive. Okay, and just allow things to settle by themselves. Okay, and this is a very foundational, a very fundamental law that things cannot remain unsettled in a state for long, because the unsettled state is not the natural state. If you sit and observe, things will settle on their own. So, in your hurry, um, um, sort of impatience to make a goal of moksha or nirvana, we are actually stirring up the pot more. So, when this mind settles, when it becomes like pure crystal, when the vrittis have ceased, three things are reflected in it without distortion: the perceiver, the perception, and the perceived. The object, the subject, and the relation between the two all merge into one. There is no more separation, there's no more confusion, there's no more chaos. Everything settles without distortion. So he says, whenever you see a thing, if you're not different from the mind, the thing will be distorted. You will see something else. You'll mix your perception into it, your ideas will become projected on it. Okay, so the mind, he says, is a very three-dimensional phenomenon. It reflects all without distortion. Ordinarily, it distorts. So when the eyes have only one dimension, they can reflect only the world. Okay, mind is three-dimensional. It reflects everything. This is the distinction that Osho is making. So in a world of reality, nothing is more valuable or less valuable. The value of things is imputed reality. It's imputed by the mind. It is not inherent in the object. So when you move to the center, leave the mind alone, watch from the center, just become absorbed in the process of observing. By and by, all ideas disappear, mind becomes clear, and then the whole is reflected: the object, the subject, and the perception. Barbara Stoller Miller translates it as, when the turnings of thought stop, a contemplative poise occurs in which thought, like a polished crystal, is colored by what is nearby, whether perceiver, process of perception, or object of perception. So she says that this section is what she calls a technical aspect of the meditative process called samāpattiḥ. And she says that Patanjali rarely uses figure of speech, but here he does. And he is sort of using the analogy of the crystal. And he says that the yogi in whom the turnings of thought have ceased recognizes that thought, like a crystal, reflects without distortion the color of any object presented to it. And this crystal-like thought allows for the realization of the nature of knowledge. And it may take as its object any of the three components of knowledge: the knower, the act of apprehension, or the object of perception, either singly or together. I hope this was useful to you. I know this is a slightly complex one. This is the sutra from which Patanjali starts getting into the siddhis that are developing due to the concentration of the mind. Yesterday's was the first one, where he says the mind gains the ability to perceive anything from the smallest to the biggest, to sort of interpret it and view it clearly. Today's is the second, where he says you attain samāpattiḥ, where there is complete absorption with that which is observed. Please do like, share, subscribe, and leave any questions, comments. I'll be happy to include them, answers when I can. And also, if you have a problem with any Sanskrit terms, if you feel I've not explained them adequately, or I've taken for granted some sort of understanding, let me know, and I'll try and include a short for my glossary on the subject. Thank you so much for listening.